The vote was 23 to 21. 2 votes. That is the margin by which the entire financial architecture of the United States was permanently restructured on February 25, 1863. 2 votes in a Senate chamber where dozens of seats sat empty because the Southern states had walked out. 2 votes cast by men who may have eaten different breakfasts that morning, or read a different letter the night before, or simply felt differently about the future than they might have on another day. I want you to hold that number, because everything that follows depends on understanding not just what was decided in that chamber, but what existed before it was decided, and why that prior thing had to be removed before the new thing could take its place. My grandfather kept a writing desk in his study, solid walnut, built sometime in the 1850s, with dovetail joints so precisely cut that the drawers still slide in perfect silence. No swelling, no sticking, no sense that the wood has shifted in any direction across nearly 2 centuries of use. When he died and I inherited it, I ran my fingers along every joint trying to understand what I was touching. I had furniture I had bought new that was already warping. This desk, built before the Civil War, before electricity, before any of the tools we consider basic to fine woodworking, was more precise than anything I had ever purchased. I started trying to find who made it. I wanted a name, a city, a workshop. What I found instead was a world, a complete and functioning economic world that existed before 1863, and that most Americans today have no idea ever existed. And once I understood how that world worked, I understood why the desk still slides perfectly, and I understood why we were never taught about the system that produced it. What was there before the Carpenters' Company of Philadelphia was founded in 1724? It is the oldest continuously operating craft guild in North America. 300 years. They were already a mature institution when the Declaration of Independence was written. Several of their members helped build the room where it was signed. Their members were not carpenters in the sense the word carries today. They were what the 18th century called master builders, one person who combined everything we now distribute across architects, structural engineers, general contractors, and project managers. One mind that understood the whole. One name permanently attached to whatever emerged from the ground. When Philadelphia needed Independence Hall, they built it. When the First Continental Congress needed a place to meet in 1774, the company offered Carpenters Hall, a building they had been constructing themselves since 1770. Both buildings still stand, not as restored museum pieces held together by modern intervention, as functional structures whose original materials have outlasted generations of supposedly more advanced construction. The company maintained a rulebook, a pricing guide containing the exact formulas their members used to calculate the cost of every element of construction, every type of joint, every beam, every foundation method, every finish. These were not estimates or ranges. They were standardized calculations verified by company officials called measurers, who always worked in pairs, or specifically so that no individual could manipulate a price for personal benefit without another person in the room to check it. In 1817, Thomas Jefferson requested a copy of this rulebook. Jefferson, who had personally designed his home at Monticello, who understood architecture and construction at a professional level, who was a former president of the United States. The Carpenters Company refused him. The rule book was for members only. Now, I spent a long time thinking about why a carpenter's pricing guide needed to be kept secret from a former president. The answer I eventually arrived at was not about carpentry at all. The rule book was not protecting a commercial advantage. It was protecting a proof of concept. It demonstrated, in precise and reproducible detail, that an entire industry could operate on the principle of transparent, fair pricing, that a community of skilled professionals could determine what things should actually cost, not what a desperate client could be pressured into paying, not what the market would extract from someone who had no way to evaluate what they were being charged, but what was genuinely fair, and that this fairness could be written down, calculated, and enforced by the community itself, without any outside institution standing in the middle and taking a percentage. That proof was dangerous, not to carpenters, to anyone whose business model depended on the gap between what something cost and what someone could be made to pay for it. The economy that ran without banks. Here is what the official version of American economic history consistently omits, because it does not support the narrative of inevitable progress toward the system we have now. For the first century and a half of American settlement, most economic activity did not involve money in any meaningful way. The Bureau of Labor Statistics published a detailed history of American wages in 1928. In that study, they described colonial economic life in terms that would seem alien to any American alive today. A system of barter existed throughout the first century of settlement, and the very scarce currency was little used in the payment of wages. Face-to-face arrangements helped bind the community together. Put that in concrete terms. A craftsman who built your furniture might be paid in food, or in firewood delivered over the coming winter, or in a promise that you would spend 3 days helping him build a new workshop in the spring. Work was exchanged for work, skill for skill, future labor for present labor, credit lines between neighbors who had known each other for decades could stay open for years, tracking flows of mutual obligation without any institution in the middle collecting interest on every transaction. The community itself was the financial system. Your reputation among the people who had watched you work and watched you keep your word over years was your credit rating. Your demonstrated history of showing up when you said you would, of delivering what you promised, of treating your neighbors the way you wanted to be treated, was your collateral. There was no application to fill out, no institution to approve you. The people around you already knew who you were. The guild system organized this web of exchange. Tie apprentices trained under masters for 7 years, not as cheap labor, though the labor was certainly useful, as the complete transmission of an entire knowledge system from one generation to the next. A master carpenter did not just teach a young man how to cut wood, he taught him to see wood, to understand its properties, its weaknesses, its behavior across seasons and decades. He taught him the mathematics of fair pricing, the ethics of the craft, the professional obligations that came with the title of master, the understanding that his name would be attached to his work for the rest of his life in the community where he lived. By the time a man completed his 7 years and began working as a journeyman, he carried the entire system inside him, not as memorized rules, but as identity. He knew what fair work cost because he had spent years learning to see costs clearly. He knew what shoddy work looked like because years of correction had calibrated his eye. He knew what his professional reputation was worth because he had watched daily how the quality of a master's previous work determined how that master was treated by the community for the rest of his life. The furniture that lasts 2 centuries is not a mystery once you understand this system. The person who built my grandfather's desk could not afford for it to fail. His name, his livelihood, or his standing in the community where his children would grow up and where his grandchildren would eventually work, all of it was permanently attached to how those dovetail joints held together across time. There was no exit, no limited liability, no moving on to the next contract. The desk had to be right the first time. The 9-month sequence. I want to show you something about timing, and I want you to look at it the way you would look at any sequence of events where the order matters. May 20th, 1862. President Abraham Lincoln signs the Homestead Act. The promise is extraordinary, and the language is simple. Any adult American citizen can claim 160 acres of public land for a filing fee of $18. Free land, the most fundamental democratic promise a government can make, distributing the nation's physical territory directly to its own people. Historians who have studied the actual economics of homesteading estimate the real cost of developing a claim at between $1,000 and $2,500 when you account for tools, seed, livestock, fencing, wells, and basic construction. The National Archives states plainly that comparatively few laborers and farmers could actually afford to build a working farm or acquire the necessary equipment. 40% of claims were ever successfully completed. The majority of the land that was distributed under the Homestead Act ended up with speculators, railroad companies, mining operations, and large cattle interests. The Homestead Act gave Americans free land they could not afford to use. February 25, 1863, 9 months later, President Lincoln signs the National Currency Act. The act creates the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency and establishes the framework for the first national banking system. The Federal Reserve's own historical archives state clearly that the primary legislative purpose was to finance the Civil War by creating institutional demand for federal government debt. National banks were required to purchase Treasury securities equal to 1/3 of their capital. In exchange, they received banknotes worth 90% of those bonds. The more money a bank wanted to issue, the more government bonds it had to buy. The system was designed from its foundation not to serve the financial needs of the population, but to create permanent buyers for federal debt. The Homestead Act created the demand for credit. The National Currency Act created the institutions that would supply it. 1864. Congress imposes a 2% tax on all state-chartered banknotes. The local currencies that communities had been using for generations become slightly more expensive to sustain. 1865, the tax rises to 10%. Within a few years, state currencies have effectively ceased to exist across the country. The local exchange networks built around them begin to dissolve. The barter relationships, the community credit systems, the guild pricing structures that had produced buildings still standing today all begin coming apart simultaneously. Not because they failed, not because communities rejected them, because a federal tax made them economically impossible to sustain, while a tax-free alternative existed. What rose in the ruins Lowell, Massachusetts, was the prototype. Established in 1822, it became the model for what followed. By the 1880s, approximately 2,000 company towns existed across the United States. The expansion happened in one generation. The speed tells you how profitable the model was for the people who controlled it. Workers in company towns were paid not in currency but in scrip, a substitute that looked like money, but could only be redeemed at company-owned establishments. You could not save scrip and carry it to another town to build a different life. You could not invest it outside the company's reach. It flowed in a closed circle from the workers' labor directly back into company revenue. The Social Welfare History Project has documented in detail what this meant in practice. Without external competition, a company stores set prices disconnected from any market reality. Company housing rented at whatever the company chose to charge. Workers who arrived with modest savings found those savings gone within weeks. Then the company extended credit for rent, for food, for the tools required to do the work. The debt grew faster than wages could reduce it, and a worker who owed more than he had earned faced legal consequences if he tried to leave. 75% of all scrip circulating in America by the 1880s was issued by coal companies in Kentucky, Virginia, and West Virginia. The men who dug the fuel that powered American industry were paid in tokens redeemable only at the place that also owned their homes and sold them their food and held their debts. We did not call it bondage. We called it employment. The Pullman strike of 1894 brought 150,000 workers across 27 states to a halt. The Presidential Commission, formed to investigate the underlying causes, examined George Pullman's model carefully and described it with a specific word: un-American. Not because exploitation existed, because what Pullman had built reproduced in the supposedly free labor economy the exact architecture of total dependence and zero exit that the Civil War had supposedly ended for everyone. By the time the Commission issued that finding, the replacement was already complete. The guild networks that had regulated fair pricing through community accountability were gone. The barter systems that had bound neighborhoods through webs of mutual obligation were gone. The neighbor-to-neighbor credit that had sustained communities through hard years without institutional intermediaries was gone. All of it dismantled in a single decade through a sequence of legislative decisions that nobody announced as a package, but that functioned as one, of the people who refused. There is a community in the United States that declined the replacement. What happened to them afterward tells you more about the old system than any historical account I have found. The Amish have maintained a contribution-based economy for over a century. When a member of an Amish community faces a medical expense they cannot cover alone, they stand in their weekly congregation and explain the situation. Everyone present contributes. The gathering does not end until the full amount has been raised. This is not charity in the sense of giving to a stranger. It is mutual insurance among people who know each other completely, who understand that their own security is inseparable from the security of everyone around them, and who have decided that covering each other directly is both more efficient and more just than paying premiums to a corporation whose business model requires paying out less than it takes in. When an Amish barn burns, the community rebuilds it in a single day. The labor is contributed, the materials are pooled. The family that lost the barn will contribute the same labor and materials the next time a neighbor needs it. The accounting is social. The debt is settled not in currency but in presence. This system works. It has worked continuously for generations. The Amish communities are not struggling at the margins of modern life. They are healthy, stable, and growing. Their farms stay in families across generations. Their members carry low debt. Their communities show none of the psychological damage associated with financial precarity that affects conventional American communities at high rates. And they had to fight the federal government for the legal right to keep doing it. The conflict was over Social Security. The Amish did not object to taxation. They pay all other federal and state taxes. They objected specifically to Social Security because they understood it not as a tax, but as commercial insurance, a product their faith prohibits them from purchasing, because purchasing it implies that the community itself cannot care for its members. They already had insurance. It was the community. They did not want or need a government institution standing in the middle of that relationship, extracting an administrative fee. The fight lasted years. Congress finally granted an exemption in 1965. Today, any Amish individual who wants to live under the community system rather than the government system must file IRS Form 4029, an application for exemption from Social Security and Medicare taxes, and a formal waiver of benefits, an application, a request for permission to use a system their community has operated successfully for over a century. Think carefully about what that means. The default legal environment of the United States makes it impossible for an ordinary community to operate on the principles the Amish use without a special congressional exemption. The old system was not left to compete on equal terms with the new one. It was made legally unsustainable for everyone who was not willing to fight the federal government for years for the right to continue. The fact that they had to fight proves the system was deliberately displaced. The fact that they are still here, still building, still covering each other, still farming land that has stayed in families for generations, proves the system they preserved actually works. The wall in the records genealogists have a name for something they encounter constantly when researching American family histories. They call it the 1870 brick wall. Before that year, tracing most American family lines becomes exponentially harder. Records are sparse. Connections are unclear. For many Americans, particularly those whose ancestors were enslaved before the Civil War, the trail simply ends. The 1890 census would have bridged that gap. It would have connected the post-Civil War era to what came before. It would have documented in recoverable detail the communities, relationships, and economic networks that existed during the decade when the old system was being replaced by the new one. It was the document that could have shown modern Americans exactly who their ancestors were in the years when the world those ancestors had built was being taken apart. We do not have the 1890 census. A fire damaged portions of it in 1896. The surviving materials sat in storage, untouched and unrestored, for 12 years. In 1933, Congress authorized their complete and permanent destruction. One day before that authorization was finalized, President Herbert Hoover laid the cornerstone for the National Archives building in Washington, a building specifically designed to be fireproof, purpose-built to ensure that exactly this kind of document would never be lost to fire or neglect or administrative indifference. The institution whose entire existence was justified by the need to protect records from destruction was founded the day after Congress authorized the destruction of the records that would have mattered most. I am not telling you what to conclude from that timing. I am showing you the sequence and asking you to sit with it. What the desk tells me. I go back to my grandfather's writing desk sometimes. The walnut has darkened over the decades into something closer to black in the deepest parts of the grain. The dovetail joints are still exact. The drawers still slide without a sound. The person who made this desk operated in a world where his professional reputation was the only guarantee he could offer and the only guarantee he needed to offer. There was no warranty card, no corporate support line, no limited liability protection between the maker and the made. The desk would be in the community where he worked for the rest of his life. His name was attached to it in the way that names attached to things when there is no escape from accountability. That accountability came from the system. The guild system made long horizon thinking the only rational professional posture because the craftsman's entire economic existence depended on work that held together across years and decades and generations. The incentive was built into the structure. You did not need a regulation requiring quality. The system itself produced quality because anything less destroyed the name that was the craftsman's only real asset. Compare that to the furniture most of us buy today, designed to fail in 5 years by engineers whose professional careers are unaffected by whether the product holds together. Manufactured by workers whose wages have no relationship to whether the finished product reaches the quality level their skill could actually achieve. Purchased with credit that charges interest rates every usury law in the pre-banking era would have treated as criminal. We call this progress. My grandfather's desk disagrees silently from the corner of the room. The questions that do not go away, the Homestead Act and the National Currency Act, passed 9 months apart. One created the demand for borrowed money, the other created the supply. The tax laws of 1864 and 1865 eliminated the community exchange systems that might have let people avoid borrowing altogether. The company towns turned workers into permanent debtors. The 1870 census created the first comprehensive federal record of individual American identity in the decade when community identity was being replaced by individual financial identity. And the 1890 census, the document that would have let modern Americans see clearly across that transition, was destroyed the day before the institution built to prevent such destruction was officially founded. The buildings the Carpenters Company built are still standing after 2.5 centuries. The furniture built by craftsmen who never signed a loan application is still holding weight after nearly 2 centuries. The Amish are still covering each other's medical bills without a corporate intermediary, still building barns in a single day, still farming land that passes from parent to child without a bank holding the deed, and the records that might have told me who built my grandfather's desk, what he was paid, in what form, who taught him, how long it took, whether he ever walked into a bank to ask permission to start his life, Those records were authorized for destruction in 1933, one day before the cornerstone of the fireproof archive was laid. 23 to 21. 2 votes on a February morning in 1863, and the world your great-great-grandparents had built and trusted and lived inside was replaced with the one we inherited. The one where furniture is designed to fall apart. The one where workers owe more than they earn. The one where a community that wants to take care of its own members has to file federal paperwork and wait for congressional permission to do it. I have only questions I cannot fully answer, but the questions do not go away, and once you start asking them, you will find they never do.